Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, Ullas, congratulations on a great book. Welcome to this evening session on behalf of Ullas, Kriti, CWS, and BIC. Ullas has spent a lifetime in protecting the big cats. He has collared a lot of them. Today I noticed that he has also collared a lot of big cats to come on stage and corralled a lot of you to be in the audience. So, Ullas, I think you're cut out for this. We must use you at BIC more often to get the people in. Today's Sutradhar is going to be Shoba Narayan. She'll walk you through the rest of the program.
Good evening. So even for those of us who are fans of the Karanths, this book was, I wanted to say it's a treat to read, but it's not a treat to read in the battles that Dr. Karanth has fought and prevailed over. Reading this book was like being allowed into the inner sanctum of a fine mind. Ullas's writing is poetic and lyrical in places. He has a deft hand with metaphors, and the information that is imparted will make all of us think. My role is to MC and introduce the speakers and pretty much stay out of the way. So it's a privilege to be here for the launch of this book. I'll introduce both the speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, who is a professor of history and environmental sciences at Ashoka University. He is an author, columnist, researcher, winner of many awards, and students have routinely described him as the best teacher that they've ever had, which, as the daughter of a professor, tickles me no end. The second speaker, Narayan Ramachandran, I don't know too well, so let me just read what I have. He was trained in engineering and then became a banker and a private equity man before moving on to his next avatar, which as a lifelong learner, I think his next avatar, he wants it to be inclusion from conservation, climate change side, from finance, financial inclusion, and also gender inclusion. He describes himself as the father of two daughters, and his daughters have sort of charted his next role, which will be to foster women entrepreneurs and women leaders. So with that, I invite Dr. Rangarajan on stage and Mr. Narayan Ramachandran after him.
Thank you very much. It's a very accurate introduction of the book, which is one of the finest books I've read in a long time. One is still of the generation where we like holding the book in hand. And when I got the invitation, I said I will try not to bring my copy because I still read with a pencil and several parts are marked in great detail. This book comes at a very interesting time because as those of us who have had the privilege of reading it, I'm sure all of those who haven't will do so, is that it actually is a reflection on about 5 to 6 decades of Indian public life. And public life centered not only on the tiger and its forest home and the struggle to study it and to work for its survival. It's also a remarkable history of what Dr. Karanth calls the greater Malnad landscape. And one of the hidden dimensions of Dr. Karanth, for me, as a historian who likes to tell stories, is that he's a first-rate storyteller. I was looking for mistakes in the book, and I found one somewhere. It described conversations he had with a bureaucrat, and he compared him to Appleby, Humphrey Appleby, in the famous Yes Minister, though he got his name as Henry Appleby. Sir Humphrey, to give him his correct name, would have said that he should be remembered with his title. And I think, to me, that part of the book is the most fascinating, the period roughly between 65 and 93. It's striking to see that someone we associate so much with the tiger, who studied, documented this species, initially in Nagarahole, then across the Western Ghats, later for a very long period of time across India, pioneered very modern new techniques of not only estimating tiger numbers, but relating the number of tigers that exist in a given area, say 100 square kilometers, to prey densities, but done so in very innovative and new ways. And here I think the role of science, the scholar in this case of the tiger, blends into the role of the citizen. Somewhere in this book, there's a alarming line, which I don't know if I should tell you. I went back and read it 3 times. It said, the more I got involved as a conservationist, the harder it got to do the science. And this, in a sense, is at the heart of his great strength, and also the many steeplechasers and barriers and gauntlets he's run. Doing science in a developing country was always going to be difficult. Doing science in the lab and doing science in the field are very different. Doing science in the forest is itself complex, because at the time when the young Ullas Karanth moved from being an engineer with a promising career ahead of him, and he goes off and tries to do farming and then decides to study wildlife, is a time when the study of science in terms of field biology and wildlife biology was literally in its infancy in India. In a sense, this is surprising. He himself was inspired, as he says, by the work of George Schaller, who played a very important role in his life after he met him in 1983. They worked together. Dr. Karanth joined the Wildlife Conservation Society, and it's fascinating. In one of the later encounters, Schaller tells him that, I feel envious of you. And here you see someone inspired by a scientist actually not just equaling, but in some senses surpassing his work. So Schaller did his work in 1964, The Deer and the Tiger, a study of wildlife in India. And the conservation of the tiger, of course, got off the ground around the time the young Ullas was visiting and beginning to get to know Bhadra, Kudremukh, Nagarhole, all of which he first visited in the late 60s and early 70s, in a very different kind of India. And I'm very struck that the period when he begins to engage is the period when wildlife conservation actually became a priority for the Indian leadership. One figure who stands out in this book, not once but many times, is Mrs. Indira Gandhi, remembered widely, of course, for the emergency, for sterilization, Sanjay Gandhi, Operation Blue Star, and so on and so forth. But I think there's something very significant in the coincidence of 2 very major transformations which happened in the early 70s. The Green Revolution, which we all know a lot about, and Project Tiger and the conservation of wildlife. Both derived from the idea that India had to make certain hard choices. In the one case, to try and develop some degree of self-reliance in grain, from being a net importer of American grain for which we did not have the foreign exchange. And the other, a sense that natural heritage was as important to India's future as its monumental heritage. In the archives of the contemporary India at the university I'm in at Ashoka, and I'm happy and proud to say that much of Dr. Karanth's correspondence, his work in English, not the Kannada, is with us. We also have some of the very interesting papers relating to Project Tiger. And among them is a letter by Indira Gandhi, which to me frames, in a sense, if you like, the larger mission of someone like Dr. Karanth. It said that Project Tiger abounds in irony. The country which was famed for millennia for this magnificent beast is struggling to save it from extinction. It's a very interesting opening line. I don't know who drafted it. Maybe H.Y. Sharda Prasad had a hand, who knows. And somewhere later it goes on to say, the tiger cannot be protected in isolation. And it explains that the conservation of the tiger would be about the protection of the ecosystem as a whole. And then goes on to say, is it really beyond our capacity to have the political will, scientific knowledge, and administrative expertise to set aside 1 or 2% of our landscape for the preservation of nature, unquote. This is 26 March 1973. Now, the interesting thing about this particular set of ideas is that they were given shape through Project Tiger. It did unfold in very interesting ways, initially in 9, now 52 odd tiger reserves. But what Project Tiger lacked was that beyond the seat of the pants science and understanding that you would have strict protection of the prey, the habitat, the major predators, it didn't really draw on the advances in science at the time. And to me, the most fascinating part of this book is the early and very interesting steps that Dr. Karanth took in Nagarhole and elsewhere. Estimating prey densities with an army of citizen volunteers, and some of the very distinguished ones are in this room. I won't embarrass them. Some of them are scientists on their own right by now. Bringing about a change in the way tigers would be estimated, the early camera trap experiments. Interestingly here, he was treading a path which had been taken by one of the great forester naturalist, somewhat unsung figure, unlike the more legendary man-eater hunter Jim Corbett, F.W. Champion, who took photographs in the Shiva lakes with tripwires. And Dr. Karanth shows us that after several exposures in black and white camera, the number of individual tigers that were actually photographed by Champion was just 9. So here we have a very old idea being adapted to new technology in a completely different environment. This is something very significant. When you're doing this kind of work in a country such as India, an elephant may damage the camera, someone may steal it, it may get damaged. All of these issues have to be controlled for. There's no ready-made solution. And what is fascinating is the picture that begins to emerge. Paradoxically, and I say this paradoxically, because while much of his work initially demonstrated much higher densities of ungulates than anyone had imagined were present in southern India. He says somewhere that the ungulate densities on the hoof were comparable to eastern, southern Africa and even higher than them. In some cases, the tiger numbers were also much larger or lower than that which the pugmark censuses showed. And here, I think, is genuinely a Humphrey Appleby syndrome. As long as you're praising government and saying it's got it right, they're all very happy. When you get onto the wrong side, lots of things can happen. And here there's something significant with the Forest Department, which is that the origins of the Forest Department in the 1860s and 70s, there's a lot of debate on it, which I won't bore you with. Was it set up in order to secure timber? Was it because of early concerns about desiccation? Was it imperial aggrandizement, let's grab it all? Or was it enlightened early technocracy? There's a big debate. But one thing is without doubt that most of the early foresters, barring the inspectors general, the first 3 were German botanists and foresters. Most of the foresters in British India were drawn from the military. They'd been a captain or a major and a colonel. So the tradition within the Forest Department of discussion is very different from the civil administration. And one of the problems is that because in its early years, particularly the first 50 years, foresters in India were close to the cutting edge of their profession globally. They were publishing scientific papers. They were studying not only how to grow teak, they were looking at regeneration rates, they were studying fire. Interestingly, some of them anticipated some of the later ideas of game management. Today, it's a very different picture. But that monopoly of truth is something very deeply inherent within the Forest Department. It's there in other government departments. I won't bore you with debates on, recession. Have we got into it? Is the economic growth rate as high as the government claims? But I think that one of the dilemmas of conservation is that unlike science done in a lab, and much more than science done in a lab, the findings that you have, particularly if you go public with them, and if they don't fall in line with government claims, you are at their receiving end. There's a very moving chapter in this about being defamed, and it's a very moving chapter because to me it's really about freedom of science, expression, and scholarship. We're familiar with the issues of freedom of expression when it comes to my discipline, history. We're familiar with it when it comes to art and to literature. But I think we are living in a world, particularly over the last 40-odd years, where the freedom of scientific discovery and of research is also imperiled, often by the powers that be. You see it very clearly today with climate change denial by some of the most powerful countries and political leaders and corporate leaders on earth till recently. You see it even with GMOs, the idea that you shouldn't have any research at all. I worked for many years at Delhi University, and Professor Paintel, who was our vice chancellor, not only had his fields of mustard burnt, or the fields where they were doing research, the records were also burnt. Now, what the people who were burning the records didn't know is that they were stored in a hard drive and there were many copies in computers. But he couldn't do research for 8 to 10 years because the court did not permit research. This has now been revised and research is permitted. Whether the use is justified or not, I won't go into. And to me, the shift of Dr. Karanth from radio telemetry of tigers away to estimating tigers, valuable, significant, important as it's been, is in part driven by this culture of intolerance. On a lighter note, there's a wonderful anecdote about a Chief Minister of Karnataka, a very colorful figure with the initials SB, expert badminton player. You can guess who it was. He comes there and he says, I love your science. I'm a progressive. The technology is great. And he said something which I think all of us in the world of scholarship should think about. He said, Karanth, I'll tell you something. I am like a buffalo. I have a thick skin. You know what? You should grow a thick skin like a buffalo. Now, SP didn't know his natural history. He should have said you should grow a thick skin like a rhino. But I think that's not the point. The question really is, if we are to have conservation, or even if we are to have a safe, habitable, productive environment, we need freedom of scholarship. And scholarship has to be in the field. And the issues that Dr. Karanth flagged then are still there in the public realm. The other, of course, is that even before the world of social media, woke and fake news and the post-truth world, I am still astonished by the manner in which tabloid journalism took up the case of the missing tigers of Nagarhole. I say this because it's when you read this book you realize that it is true 5 tigers did die at the time, but none of them had anything to do with the radio telemetry. But this is something of great significance in public life. I think that those of us in the world of public debate should not forget that there's a large world out there, and in our country that world is infinitesimally there in English. It's there in Kannada, Tamil, Hindi, Bangla. So I think that there's a very interesting shift that happens. But the other consequence of the shift is that when there's a major tiger crisis in 2005, there's a huge debate, there was the Tiger Task Force. I think Dr. Karanth stood out for 2 reasons. First, he talked to all the members of the Tiger Task Force. Conservation is about saving the planet. It's about saving their species. It's about saving nature. But sometimes when you see conservationists talk to each other, it would be nice if some of that love and affection was also there for each other, particularly when we disagree with each other. I think what's fascinating is that 2 of his very long-held convictions, which emerged from his research, were taken aboard by that report. The first, the idea that it would be important to try and have areas where there's no human settlement and biomass extraction in order to minimize conflicts between tigers and people or tigers and cattle. And in order to do this, the task force took aboard the idea of voluntary relocation and provided a much better package. The first acknowledgement at a national level of that. The other was that it jettisoned the practice, which had been important from the 70s, of counting tigers by pug marks. Now, as a student of history, I'm very fascinated that they tried to count tigers by pug marks, because pug mark censuses were pioneered by Saroj Raj Chowdhury, very legendary forester from Odisha. He set up the Simlipal Reserve. He drew on earlier practices of game trackers in princely states and efforts by others, officers in the British era. But interestingly, the pattern of pugmark census actually is what in Hindi is called Anguta Chhap. It's the fingerprints. And incidentally, fingerprints were developed by a member of the Imperial Police Service in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, just as fingerprints had their limitations, so did pugmarks. The problem, of course, is that when they jettisoned the pugmark census, the manner in which they went about doing the new tiger estimations did not involve the kind of transparency which one would have expected. So government embraces new technology, but the problem anyway is not just with the technology, it's with transparency and open public debate. So India is a democracy, we're all very proud of that. Liberty is something very dear to all of us, but science and conservation require much more open debate. And I think that this is a book of celebration of a person who's led his life trying to push the barriers of the debate. There are many questions one may debate and disagree on, and I'll just flag 2 because I think they will come back in the future. To me, the most fascinating part of the book is the last 30 pages, because it is what I call a manifesto for the future. Here is someone looking 10, 15, 20, 25 years ahead and comes to a counterintuitive deep discovery. The counterintuitive discovery is that India, according to him, cannot hold 3,000 or 3,500 tigers. It could hold 5, 10, or even 15,000 tigers, provided. And I find the provided very interesting because part of it is based on a very serious critique. It is that in the last 15, 20 years, so much money has come into the tiger reserves that a lot of habitat manipulation is being done. It's astonishing to read here that this habitat manipulation has driven up densities of ungulates as well as tigers and packed these reserves. It's not taken into account the natural features of those areas, the need to keep those, the geophysical, biophysical, flora, fauna roughly intact as they are and let them go about their business. In a sense, it's moved from preservation to active manipulation. And one of its consequences is that the larger habitat is getting neglected. So I really think it's fascinating to see such an ambitious view that we think of not 80,000 square kilometers as possible tiger habitat, but probably another 300,000. How this will be achieved, the sociology, the politics, the culture, I think is still to be debated. There's a very interesting idea here of expanding tiger tourism. There's also an interesting idea that displacement, relocation shouldn't be done by government. It should involve civil society. But to end on two important notes, this is a book which will stand the test of time. It will stand the test of time because ostensibly, it's about the author, his challenges, his adventures, his experiences, the species and the lands and the animals and the people whom he has deep regard for, and sometimes they don't have regard for him, but he's a raconteur who does give the other side its due, after which, of course, he has his say. But the other reason is, I think this is a remarkable period piece. It's a book of intellectual, cultural, environmental history, which has been lived by someone with a very deeply intense sense of time and place. I don't think this is surprising. Just last year, I had the occasion to read Growing Up Karanth. Well, this is the grown-up Karanth. And I think you'll all agree that we are looking forward to the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to steal a line from Ravi. I feel like that little Malabar civet cat sitting in front of all these big cats before me, Professor Rangarajan and Ullas and Shiv. So I approach my task with a little trepidation. I'm not going to speak about tigers or history or approach because that's not my core competence, and little civets stick to their little territory when the big cats are roaming around. So I will stick to something that I know related to what Ullas Karanth has written in this book. This book is I think part memoir, part autobiography. For those who don't know the distinction, please go look it up. It's not the full account of Ullas Karanth's life. It's a very important section of it, perhaps the most important section of it, but it's not the full one. So in that sense, it's a memoir. But there's also a lot of autobiographical elements with very specific dates, times, and historical record keeping that Ullas has brought to the book. So as I said, I'm not going to talk about tigers. I'm not going to talk about Ullas, who are the biggest characters in the book. There are, of course, even though this is a terrestrial book, I won't even talk about the sharks that he encounters pretty much through the entire political economy that he has to deal with. I'm instead going to talk about the approach or the broader framework that Ullas writes about in the latter third of the book, really. And it is here that he makes you think a little bit. And before I get to the specific observation as it relates to conservation and ecology and maybe even climate change, let me give you the framework that I think will be useful for you to take away to apply to the great questions of our time. So as I think Professor Rangarajan briefly alluded to, there is this spectrum of optimism and pessimism that can be the lens through which you view some of the greater questions of our time. So the pessimists are always claiming that it's over, the world is close to end, and we, the human beings, have put it there. The optimists are people like Ullas, and I'll come back to that in a second, but beyond the optimists, they're the denialists, and the denialists say, it's our time on Earth, and we're going to do with it what we like, and technology will completely bail us out. The denial that we have heard so often with respect to the climate debate. A lot of it happens with biodiversity and conservation as well. Closer to the pessimist end is what I call wokeism, and so this political correctness has crept into a lot of debate on both climate change and conservation, and it has become so axiomatic and rigid that you can't really get beyond. So for instance, and Ullas makes reference to this in the book, for instance, this idea that individuals are become personified and need to be saved. So man-eating tigers included, the individual needs saving, and the distinction between the biodiversity-related species conservation and the individual is kind of lost in debate. The passion comes from the personification, and the passion is preserved, but the science gets lost. At the other end is what Ullas advocates towards the end of the book, which I would call, you can call it pragmatism, you can call it eco-modernism. It is the use of science to this idea of climate change or conservation or ecology, and using it in a manner in which it produces solutions for the problem. Max Roser, who's one of the guys who came up with the pragmatism philosophy from the American school, says that three things can be simultaneously true. One is, the world is much better than you thought it was, or you claim it is. The world is awful, and the world can be much better. All three things can be simultaneously true, and I think the modernists believe that by using science, technology, and data, you can actually move to a place where you begin to think of problems and solving them in a manner in which there is a way. So Ullas in particular, I think, uses 5 approaches in the book. One is science and data, as I said. The second is always looking at the issue with a problem-solving mind. I think, the early chapters of the book describe his sort of migration of career from engineer to naturalist, but that engineering mind becomes useful in this problem-solving approach that Ullas, we all know to have, and is amply evident in the book. The third one is one that puts sort of evolving and continually evolving technology at the center of this problem-solving approach. At that time, 30 years ago, it was this radio collaring, but science is moving, and with genetics as well, there's a lot of new techniques by which we can advance the conservation effort. But lastly, this notion of actively embracing human development and conservation, but in a very focused and clear-headed way. I think the clarity is missing. The denialists say you don't need it at all, and the woke people essentially say you need to do it all the time, everywhere, in all instances. And neither prescription is, I think, valid. Let me just read a couple of quotes from the book that sort of illustrate these principles. One, Ullas says, is the willpower to save tigers already exists. It must now be focused, laser-like, and I think that's an operative word, and actions that matter, another operative word. This can only come through a societal ability to separate the signal of science from the noisy hype around tigers. So I think each word has been weighed very carefully in that particular quote. And then to rephrase what Professor Rangarajan said, tiger recovery is not a zero-sum game. The coexistence can be sustainably managed using the full range of tools we already have at our command. So again, this idea that you can problem solve in a manner in which you have focused areas of sustainability, focused areas of human development, and where they are in conflict, you have a very clear-headed way of thinking through the conflict. This is a great book, not least for the fact that Ullas is an outstanding raconteur with an outstanding ability to bring metaphor to the book and write with excellent diction. It's also a great book because it makes you think. And that's, I think, what I would leave with you additionally, that it makes you think about how you yourself need to place yourself in the context of these big questions of the day. I think it's not enough to say, I agree with everything. I guess each spot on that framework and spectrum is important, but you need to sort of self-select for yourself where you are on it. I, for one, select myself to be at a very similar spot to where Ullas is on that spectrum. That's probably because I was trained as an engineer as well, but it is also a very hopeful sort of point on the spectrum to be, which is that data, science, technology can make tigers grow from its current population, which we don't know what exactly it is, to 3 or 4 times what it is today. So thank you.
I just wanted to come before the panel discussion and say that the book covers, I'm 74, it covers, from the age of 8, I considered myself a naturalist, as a bird watcher, whatever. Then I went through several professions. Then I became a serious conservationist, I would say, by the age of 20. And I became a trained wildlife scientist at the age of, in my mid-30s. So through this period, I accomplished a lot. I failed in a lot of things, but the accomplishments are not mine alone. There's a huge number of people who mentored me, huge number of people who were my peers, who stood by me, and people I call my students, in the sense people 10 years younger than me, who also brought me up. So I'm very, very grateful to all of them. It's almost impossible to list them all here. They are listed in the book fairly comprehensively in the acknowledgements. But there are a few people I want to mention by name. First and foremost, my wife Pratibha, who has survived this ordeal, and we have been married 48 years. So certainly she's in the lead position there. Then among the senior people who mentored me in the forestry department particularly, I am sometimes now viewed by the present day foresters as some kind of an enemy of the foresters. On the contrary, my exposure to forest department goes to 1966 and continues to this day. Was Shivasharan's father, Shyam Sundar, who was my cousin. He was 15 years older than me, and he took me to the forest. At the lower end of that spectrum, I met K.P. Achaya, K.M. Chinnappa, who were also several years older than me, who held my hand in the jungle and taught me jungle craft. There were many people in between, too long to list, but there are 4 or 5 people in that crisis period of my life, foresters who stood by me. The senior foresters I must mention: U. Taranath Alva, A.C. Lakshman, and Sampangi. Mr. Parameshwarappa was supposed to be here. Okay. Then through some of these struggles, Mr. Ram Prakash was here, and among the younger lot, Mr. P.J. Dilip Kumar is here. He is the only Kannadiga to ever hold the position of Director General of Forests. So many of these senior foresters. Then senior IAS officers, Dr. M.K. Ranjit Singh, who was instrumental in the, and T.N. Sheshan, instrumental in getting the first radio telemetry permits there. And in Karnataka, there were a couple of people who I worked very closely with. He's not here, Mr. Gopal Krishna Gowda, who is here in accomplishing things on the ground. Mr. Sivasailam is here. Mr. Dhirendra Singh, who retired as Forest Secretary, who was through the thick of this fight with the government, he was a period Forest Secretary. These were on the government side. I had to work with the government because wild animals live on government land. Otherwise, I didn't have to deal with or depend on anybody. And in the conservation group, there were my peers who came as recruited volunteers, whatever. Praveen Bhargav, H.N.A. Prasad is here. V. Krishna Prasad sprained his back, so he's not here. Nachaya Puttu Chittiappa. There are whole dozens of them who really brought me up in crisis times. And when I kind of trained myself and started training others, there are 2 people who I mentored who are here. My first PhD student, N. Samba Kumar, probably unknown to many, India's finest wildlife biologist, and Dr. G.V. Reddy, one of its fine forest officers, who was my second PhD student. I'm so proud of these 2 students of mine. Then, lastly, the book is a lot about tabloids, and I had a war with them. There was a tabloid journalist, I made him close his tabloid and join my staff, and he's probably the most unheard but the most accomplished conservation in India. He was supposed to be here, maybe here. P.M. Muttanna, he's somewhere in the audience, I don't know. So I really want to stand up here and say, this is all your effort. It's not just Ullas Karanth. Thank you.
All right, okay, Dr. Ullas Karanth. Welcome everyone. So I have the next around 20 minutes to have a good discussion with Dr. Karanth, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. So what I'll start out is, I have a few kind of questions which are along kind of different dimensions. One, I would like to kind of really ask you, it comes out very clearly, your love for Malenadu, the 100-kilometer wide fragile stretch on both slopes of the Western Ghats. That has been your kind of central to your professional life. But Malanadu has seen a lot of change since 1947 to this day, especially with kind of booming population and, more importantly, aspirations of people. So how would you, for our audience, give us a sense of how does this change of Malanadu and how it has changed and where tiger conservation fits in right now in this booming landscape?
I think the way to put it is, the best way to put it is to read the book, but the shorter way is, when I was getting into this, let's say late 60s, there were not more than 70 to 100 tigers in the landscape. The population was 1/3 of what it is. Average wage for a man was 1.5 rupees to 2.5 rupees per day. People hunted for protein, and tigers were on the verge of extinction. From 1967 to 1982, I finally was able to see a tiger, wild tiger, after 15 years. So I have seen the transition. I have seen the transition where tiger numbers have now gone up to 350 or 400. Human populations has probably at least doubled. And average wage for a man working has gone up from 2.5 rupees to 600 rupees, and you won't get labor. They come from Assam. Economic growth has been there. Natural recovery has been there. It's not all a nice story, but the point is, if it's possible today that an area like that, where I saw dead tigers being paraded in the streets of Puttur, tigers being poisoned, today has this landscape and few areas around it have the largest wild tiger population in the world. So that makes me an optimist for sure. This is no reason for giving up. That's my central message from this.
Okay. In your book, you've kind of front and center talk about threats to wildlife and specifically to tiger populations, viable tiger populations, given the way the landscapes are changing. So now in 2021, 2022, what would you think are the 3 top threats to tiger conservation?
The threats initially in the entire landscape was hunting for protein. Hunting of ungulates for protein. It's more important than tiger. Saving the wild ungulate prey was the issue. And that threat has diminished significantly in the protected areas, but still prevails in other areas. So if we manage or if we protect as rigidly as we are protecting Nagarhole and Bandipur and some of these places, I have a scientific paper out there that shows we can have 1,300 tigers in Karnataka, not 300 or 400 that we have now. So it's really 3 things. One is uniform law enforcement, particularly anti-hunting laws. The second thing is accommodating development outside of areas that are priority for conservation, not ignoring it, but developing it, but not percolating development into every corner through building rural roads, carrying development to the heart of the forest. And some of the threats have vanished. Livestock grazing on a massive scale was a huge problem. That's been replaced by, ox carts have been replaced by diesel vehicles and things like that. But there is a new threat coming, which is green energy. It's supposed to be green, but it's leading to more deeper penetration of the Ghat forests for most of these projects that are completely economically unviable, surviving on tax holidays and subsidies, both wind turbines and microhydel projects. We don't have solar, fortunately, in the Malnad, but in the dry plains, that's a problem. So these are some of the new issues that we have to address. But underneath it all is ignoring of good science in policy, because unlike the early days when people who had an interest or some scientific knowledge, they were welcomed in to give inputs, which is true even today in financial investment or medicine, but in conservation, expertise has been drowned by noise. It is all sorts of showboaters who are advising the government on everything. So we cannot arrive at a rational solution with this kind of a thing.
Right. for a lot of the people who are interested in wildlife conservation, the threat of wildlife trade looms large. Is that so also in the Deccan Plateau and peninsular India, or is that less, especially international trade? Because the papers are always full of this trade kind of penetrating through globalization, distant markets for specific wildlife components, and kind of making use of highly inequitable systems in order to kind of derive. How much of that is important for tiger conservation measures here in India?
There are two issues here. Trade for larger animals like elephant ivory, tigers, was a major threat a few years ago, but I think, one, the effectiveness of enforcement as well as other avenues of opportunities opening up for poor people who will no more risk that, has removed that threat somewhat. But the trade-related threats exist for certain other species, particularly pangolins, which are not glamorous at all. But they're being slaughtered and finished off to meet the international trade. But as far as the Malnad forests and tiger and the biodiversity around tigers is concerned, the bigger threat comes from the trade in non-timber forest products. This is seen as a solution, and that's the problem. Debarking of 300-year-old dipterocarp trees, harvesting every product to exhaustion. There were canes as thick as my knees when I was wandering in the forest. Today, canes are virtually gone. And this exploitation, in the name of sustainable support for rural people, is a bigger threat than actually logging or timber today. Trade keeps shifting, patterns keep shifting. Habitat is threatened by non-timber forest product extraction. To me, that's a big threat which is not even on the radar screen of conservationists.
Okay, I think that kind of really goes to your central issue in your book, as far as kind of I'm kind of concerned, is in the very last chapter, you speak of the social and technological transformations necessary to bring the tiger back. And I would like you to kind of elaborate a little bit for the audience so that they'll rush out and buy your book and maybe even send it off to their cousins and aunts. What is the social and technological transformation you would like to see happen? Then I have a part 2, which is about you take aim at the bureaucratization of tiger conservation and suggest that unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit of people in India and elsewhere is critically needed. So I'd like you to kind of first discuss what's the kind of the social and technological transformation that you would like to see in order to enhance tiger conservation. And then second, this whole issue of kind of bureaucratization and versus the entrepreneurial spirit.
The first one, it's not just tigers, it's about saving nature in a developing world. I think a lot of the proposals that want everything at the same place, conservation and development together, animals and wildlife living mixed together, I don't think that's an ecologically sound proposition. It's possible, perhaps, if the human population density was not 500 but 2 per 100 square kilometer. So that's not going to work. At the same time, preaching denial and treating poverty like an exalted state of existence, spiritual existence, and denying people what they need while we enjoy it and preaching it to others, to me is very hypocritical. And a lot of the conservation development community is indulging in this hypocrisy. I think we have to give people what they want, which is a better life. And so 2 proposals, I arrived almost independently at this. But these proposals were, one was a proposal by John Robinson against this whole caring for the earth and grow Harlem, Brundtland and those kind of generic documents, saying that there is limits to caring and this is how it should be done. There should be areas that are strictly, the context will vary, but a proportion of land for protecting nature strictly, where incompatible users have to be taken off. There's a larger agricultural, semi-agricultural area where some forms of biodiversity and some forms of human productivity can coexist. It's not that all species need strict hands-off approach. And the third is really intensively used areas for modern agriculture, energy generation, which then go on to meet the needs of people. coupled to this is the idea that actually originally proposed by James Lovelock, whose people think he was a fuzzy old guy who proposed the Gaia theory. He was one of the best scientists of the century. Is that we have to decouple from nature to save it. Not putting more and more people to consume nature is not going to, it's not an approach that's going to work, given the scale at which nature has shrunk, particularly when Earth's population will hit 10 billion by 2050. We have to decouple. And it made me think, and I saw decoupling actually happening in Malnad landscape. I had not recognized it. First was this huge livestock issue that I talked about. You drove from Bangalore to Mysore, you would see 200 or 300 ox carts. You don't see one now.
Hunsur, yeah.
Yeah, this all the haulage, all the tillage was livestock, gone. That was the major reason why we needed so much livestock. So they're all replaced by hydrocarbon-driven small vehicles, but it's from the preservation of the forest perspective, making both. The second thing was fuel. The common people's energy was wood. If you went to any of the Malnad areas, you would see literally millions of women and men cutting trees and bringing out for cooking and selling in local towns. Whether it was Lakkavalli, Bhadravati, Kumta, you would see this, literally the forest being carried on its head. Many of the older foresters here have seen that era. And there was no way the forest could sustain that. And it went not just because of restriction, but cooking with wood was so toxic to people, so uncomfortable. And as the wood receded, people moved away from that. And today, that wood fuel collection is not the biggest of threats to habitat. So this was decoupling in action that I saw. The third decoupling was cultural. When I was growing up in Puttur, and later when I wandered with your father and Mr. Parmeshwarappa and Alva in the forest, entertainment, rural entertainment, social entertainment was hunting. You took a gun, you walked, you shot something, you didn't shoot something. It was a social thing that men did. So I remember one motorcycle ride from Talkaveri to Nagarhole where I saw 8 or 10 groups of people with dogs going and hunting at night. It was open. I mean, nobody stopped them. You still see this in Jharkhand, Orissa, not in our places. So, partly it was protein dependency. Because protein was expensive, you had to get it from bush meat, literally like a bush meat thing. Over time, what we have seen is because of agricultural productivity, particularly the Green Revolution related things, the shift into manufacturing and service sector, the demographic changes, incomes have gone up. As I mentioned, wages have shot up 600, 700. And because of these modern farming practices, you go every 100 meters in rural Malnad or other parts, you will see a chicken center with a mesh cage. So people are not willing to walk 8 to 10 kilometers to shoot a civet and come back. They are happy walk 50 meters and buy it off. So this farm protein replacing wild protein has been really a significant decoupling that I have seen. The last bit was cultural. Hunting was a cultural activity. Now they would rather use that time to watch cricket, watch TV. Every person has a cell phone. Entertainment comes in different forms. You don't have to go and hunting. So these are living examples of decoupling that Ted Nordhaus talks about that I've witnessed. So I'm sort of proposing Robinson's spatial sustainable landscapes and Stuart Brand's decoupling eco-modernist ideas together as a possible solution, tentative possible solution.
Okay, before we get to the second part of bureaucratization, I wanted to ask you, in some sense, tourism is actually a coupling. So there is both enormous potential for wildlife conservation as well as it can be deeply threatening, especially when you look at the numbers that go into Kabini and so on. So what is your view of how do we actually enhance the benefits and in some sense try to mitigate the downside of wildlife tourism?
Thank you for reminding me. I've gone into that in quite a bit in that book, and Kriti and I proposed a model in Economic and Political Weekly about suggesting this approach, which is if you go to Africa, you see this working as farming becomes less economically profitable than hunting ranches. People abandon their livestock and raise wildlife on their land, and people go and hunt, and the net result is the farmer makes money, more money than farming. The next step is tourism. Like you see these private reserves, which are 15, 20 square kilometers all around Kruger. Farmers have converted land to wildlife tourism, hooked up with lodges, and they make more money from tourism than from farming. Mm-hmm. So this is the only model that will allow expansion of current wildlife habitats beyond the 4%, miserable 4% is what we have in protected areas in India, which is no way what a country aspiring for a $5 trillion economy should have. We should have at least 10% for nature. And that can happen if this model becomes possible. It's more complicated here because the holdings are not 5 square kilometers per farmer. Fragmented. It's much smaller. The management required is complicated. But the bottom line is profit. Given the rise in incomes, our 300 million strong middle class, the crowds you see in Kabini, people willing to pay $50,000 a night to spend some of these lodges, the money is there. If it can flow into the farmer's hands, you can see large-scale transformation of farmlands to wildlife habitat. Is it possible? Is it doable? I have seen it happen in the case of coffee, which came in the 19th century, mid-19th century. It transformed a whole set of forest areas into coffee. Why? Because people didn't love coffee. They were making more money. Same thing, all the areca nut fields were paddy fields. Why did people switch to areca? Not because they love the areca plant, although they claim that now, but that's not true. It was simply more profitable. Tobacco came into Periyapatna, Hunsur area. Wholesale conversion happened because farmers made more money than ragi. If we can create those incentive, market-driven mechanisms for turning landscapes for wildlife viewing, channeling this money that's all going and being dumped on Kabini and a few places, I think it's a possible, at least we should try pilot experiments, we should do the economic analysis. Not a single economic analysis exists of this trade-off. So that's the right point. Yeah, I missed that.
Okay. Can you tell me when I have 4 minutes left, Shoba, so that then we can open it up to the audience? Thank you. Now you come to a very central issue you have kind of hinted at, is bringing in the entrepreneurial spirit, making farmers the net beneficiaries and so on. But at the same time, we do have, for many people, it's an obstacle, but for a lot of others, that's the way India has always been, is the role government plays in our lives. So in that sense, for wildlife conservation, the role of government is critical as kind of regulating, setting the rules, implementing them, and so on. What are your views in our kind of current century? What should be the role, and what can the government do and should do to bring in the right kind of local domestic involvement of companies, of the private sector, of scientists that are more field-based, working on these issues? What could be the new role for government that you see is not being done?
Let me clarify, go back a step. I think wildlife sanctuaries and national parks are public lands. They have to be protected, and unfortunately, just showing slides won't protect them. You need people, armed guards patrolling them, because the value of timber and wildlife. So I see that protectionist role certainly must be the government's. It cannot be privatized. It cannot be handed over to village communities or whoever. At least in main parts of India where the administrative structure is in place. There are places like Nagaland where no bureaucracy has any power, where the power vests outside the bureaucracy. We may have to come up with a model. But somebody has to patrol these areas. But government's role certainly is primarily that. And to some degree, when there is a conflict between wildlife and people, the government has to be the arbiter in terms of how the people are compensated. But when I got into exposure with the forest department in 1966, you would not believe it. There was one single chief conservator, and there were 5 conservator forests and maybe about 25 or 30 DFOs managing the same areas or larger area of forests. Today, you know the numbers there, look at the pay scales. See, this goes back to a Marxist economist called Kalik. He said, bureaucracy becomes a social class. It feeds on itself and creates more niches. And we have seen that in many fields, particularly so in conservation, where the legitimate role of law enforcement has now add-ons like tourism, research, village education, and with the World Bank model even replacing the Tahsildar and the DC. This expansion has to stop, and the focus has to go back to learning from people like Chinnappa and people who really fought the trench war. That trench war is not ended. It still needs to be done. So this whole shrinkage of the bureaucracy, I certainly believed in this sector. In terms of involving the other people, certainly, for example, nature education, wildlife tourism, there are experts. Go with the naturalist who knows it's a different experience than going in one of these rattling vehicles with, with a person who doesn't understand. These are all very specialized fields. Wildlife research, statistical ecology, these are specialist fields. Please don't monopolize it with the government. Tourism, wildlife tourism itself, running tourist lodge. I don't think the government should be running tourism lodges. So there are many ways from places where the government has to withdraw. That is how there can be space for other people to come. Nature education. Mm-hmm. Wildlife filmmaking, it's an art. It shouldn't become a government monopoly where you give a contract to some favorite of yours and he makes a film praising you. This is not how it should be done. So there is ample scope for privatization. Has paid off in telecom. It has paid off in very many sectors. We have seen a complete change because of drawing in private enterprise. In conservation, it's going the reverse way. This needs to stop.
Okay, just to make sure that people don't mistake it, you're not talking about privatization of public lands.
Absolutely no.
All.
Absolutely no. But if some cooperative of farmers sets up 20 square kilometers of land between the Kabini Reservoir and there's a triangular piece, and if they want to create a private sanctuary there, have wildlife on lands, and they manage and protect, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
But certainly not 1 inch of public land should be given.
Okay. Now I think we have less than 4 minutes. I found your juxtaposition of your title very interesting. The subtitle of your book is Fighting to Bring Back Asia's Big Cats. And at face value, to me, it suggests a contradiction with the main title, Among Tigers. Because Among Tigers promises abundance and so on. And then you're like, hello, fighting to bring back Asia's big cats. But knowing you, I also know that that has been your professional existence. As long as I know, right from when I was a little kid, you'd come in a motorbike, I don't know, Java or one of those spluttering motorbikes, you'd come and then get carted off to the forest. Can you elaborate for this audience how you have kind of actually maneuvered this while fighting to save the big cats, but also being amongst them, and without losing heart, without losing hope, taking on all of these incredibly difficult challenges that has come your way, but also triumphing in many of them. So the contradiction that has played out in your own life.
That's a tough one to answer because I have failed more than I have succeeded. If I had focused on one, let's say just my science, I would have collared 100 tigers and published 400 papers by now. The numbers are very much lower because I had these distractions.
But that is if you measure success by the number of publications.
No.
That is not a good hallmark.
I have dabbled in a lot of things because I have interest beyond tigers. But coming to your point as to why the title is like that, because most book buyers who can afford this book are older. So the big title, Among Tigers, is in large letters so they can go and pick up the book. The subtitle tells you what the book is about.
I don't think that's a satisfactory enough answer. You can't just wiggle out of that. Give it another try. We have 2 more minutes.
No, there's no great philosophy. See, I have been involved in tiger conservation outside India. Although my focus has been in Malnad or across India, I have been involved in Russia, in Cambodia, virtually for WCS everywhere. Although I denigrate my own country in many ways in this book, but if you look at the situation elsewhere, I am very proud as an Indian, because no other country has done as much. Perhaps Nepal has, given they have so much more constraints. But other than that, none of the Asian countries, people are willing to tolerate tigers like our people are. In fact, there's a constituency for tigers, at least in the urban areas. But even in the rural areas where they suffer depredations from elephants and tigers, 500 people are killed by elephants in India every year. No other country will tolerate this. That goes back to our roots. I think there is a genuine, deep foundation of tolerance in Hinduism for right of other species to exist, defined in a very spiritual way. Essentially, that's my argument. It can't be individuals, but it has to be species rights. It's recognized, and it makes the job of modern conservation area. It lays a foundation. So I'm very happy I was born here, and all the troubles I went through were worth it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Karanth, a huge sense of gratitude for everyone who is passionate about this field. And incredible career. Congratulations on the book. My question is, it was interesting to see your perspective on the decoupling that we've seen over the years. I'm also worried about the coupling that we see in the form of sort of poor policy making that is happening right now as we develop. And I'm not suggesting that we don't develop or go through degrowth. The fact that we see is that as we're developing, there is sort of mindlessness in land planning and land use. There are highways going through the forest reserves, there are mines that are being put in where impacts the corridors of movement. How do we, and given this particular environment right now where activism is also seen with a lot of skepticism by the powers to be, how do you suggest us to sort of see, make progress in this environment?
Yeah, this is a very important point. In fact, we skipped this. As I describe in the book, Kudremukh mine was a classic case of this kind of abuse of land. I think for everything there's a place and time. I think a lot of shortcuts are being here. Dr. Dilip Kumar, who was DG Forests, and I were on the Forest Advisory Committee, and we went and shot down a lot of these projects. That whole role of the brake, we have to view economic development and conservation, all of it as an automobile. If you view it that way, the engine is industry, development, growth. The steering wheel and brake are environment, conservationists. Both need to be active. The second thing is, I think we are not using the best technologies even when we can reduce the damage. For example, I have seen in China and many places, there is today technical ability to build very high bridges, deep tunnels, cutting across very fragile mountains. We are still going to our old contractor friends and multi-lane highways and destroying the Western Ghats. So I think some of these technologies can really be applied to mitigate not everything, but some of these crucial connectivity issues of linear formations and linear pipelines, highways, power lines. There are a lot of trade-offs. For example, again, when Dilip was on the FAC, we got a proposal from Karnataka to say we need a permission to cross the big power project in Padubidri to bring electricity, that 5-kilometer stretch. We said, yes, 5 kilometers we'll give you, but dismantle the power line to Kudremukh, which has been stopped now, don't keep that. So, there's a lot of offsets and trade-offs. There are ways of doing it, but the criticality of it is to bring independent, good technology and science. Now the system is being driven by contractors, FAC is packed with yes men. So unless you have the system in place, it's very hard. But I think this is an important issue. I mentioned green energy, so some of the development is certainly not good in my opinion. So that's a short answer to a very, very significant question. Dr. Harsha, please.
Yeah. My question is very focused. See, tiger conservation resonates a lot, as you rightly said, with urban, elite, literate kind of constituency. But right now what's happening, it's more of expression of feelings on social media, reading some fancy books. Beyond that, when we look at the ground realities, it is those old conventional snares which are still killing. It is again a lot of poisonings which are still happening. Very recent memories will throw light on again snares killing tigers. Do you think we have been effective in making this feeling of owning up this tiger conservation by the community, irrespective of whatever we speak? Again, the local communities have to be brought up to a level wherein they own up that these are my tigers. I will protect them. Can you please throw some light on this as to how can we take this elite, very urban kind of constituency who have that flair for tiger conservation into real action rather than just exchange of few social media messages? Can we make them step into actual conservation? Thank you.
Yeah, this is an important question, but I think I don't think, there's a lot of nonsense on social media, but the point is a strong middle class has always driven human rights, women's rights, Congress Party, freedom fight, everything was driven by the lower middle class, upper middle class, the middle class India. So I don't think this is a negative. Secondly, particularly through the Kannada press and, if our outreach is more there, I was astonished in some cases where it was common practice in villages if a leopard is caught in a snare to go and club it to death. Now people are calling the forest department to get it. So there is a change of attitudes. I think it's a question of income levels. Once you have enough to eat and your livelihood is not threatened by wildlife, you start having mental space for supporting conservation. But as you point out, it's an important issue, but I don't think government being the mother and father is going to solve that issue. I think we have to find solutions outside the government for developing this empathy.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Karanth, I have a question, and this is something I looked up on the phone just to double check.
Okay.
India's nationally determined commitments, the climate change commitments, speak nothing about biodiversity conservation. It's all about decarbonizing the energy, which is some of the green energy projects you're talking about. Because it goes to the core of what the focus currently within the different levels of government, national, state, and then the line departments. Is there a way to get biodiversity conservation as part of the climate change commitments that the national government can think of? And if there is a way, what could that mechanism look like?
First of all, I'm not a real expert in this. So I think there's RED++ where biodiversity, I know that's not a part of it. Probably this is a very good topic for Shiv. He's kind of dabbling in that for many years. Maybe after the session you could ask him. It's not real. But the point is, clearing a forest and growing more carbon will get you carbon credit. Protecting a natural area with full biodiversity doesn't get you carbon money. Yeah. So, and Kriti also has some ideas about doing that, so we can have a separate discussion. But this is not really my baby.
So I'm told we just have 3 more minutes. So maybe, Ullas is usually very good, maybe 2 more.
Okay. Good evening, sir. I'm Atish. And my question is that it seems to me that a lot of conservation efforts are related to international relations also. Because you mentioned pangolin, for example, right? Now, one of the bigger markets for pangolin is China, for example. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what India's efforts have been in this and what needs to be done more, because we don't see wildlife being talked about when we talk about international relations or India's foreign policy.
It's not foreign policy per se, it's foreign trade.
Yeah.
which is a different thing. This is a commercial thing, and I think the pangolin trade, the forest department is cracking down on it. I hear reports constantly. Whether it's enough on a scale that's enough, I don't know. But certainly compared to most other countries which are exporting pangolins by the shipload, I think we are doing a better job. So I think the international relation is a different area where you use wildlife for diplomacy, those kind of things. The cheetah business is more of that. India got a concession not objecting to ivory hair sales in Namibia, so we got a quid pro by getting 5 cheetahs who will remain in eternal captivity.
Thank you again, all of you.